What happens when the world's most powerful military looks south and sees not just a border crisis, but an existential threat to its own sovereignty? We're witnessing something unprecedented unfold between Washington and Mexico City right now, a collision course that could redefine North American security for generations. President Trump has made it crystal clear. The cartels operating with near impunity across Mexico aren't just criminals anymore. They're being framed as terrorist organizations, and that classification changes everything. We're talking about potential military strikes on Mexican soil, drone operations, special forces raids, the kind of intervention that would make Iraq look like a footnote. But here's where it gets complicated. Mexico's leadership has drawn a hard line, categorically rejecting any foreign military presence. President Sheinbaum isn't backing down, invoking national sovereignty with the kind of language we haven't heard since the Cold War. This isn't just diplomatic posturing, this is two nations with deeply intertwined economies, shared borders, and millions of families on both sides staring down a conflict that neither can afford, but both seem willing to risk. The fentanyl crisis has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, and Washington is running out of patience. Meanwhile, Mexico sees this as a direct assault on its independence. What we're watching is the potential unraveling of an entire geopolitical framework that's held North America together since NAFTA. Let's talk about what's really happening here, because the mainstream narrative is missing the forest for the trees. When Donald Trump floats the idea of military strikes against cartels in Mexico, we need to understand this isn't some off-the-cuff remark or political theater designed for his base. This represents a fundamental shift in how Washington perceives its relationship with Mexico, and more importantly, how it views its own security architecture in the 21st century. The United States has conducted military operations in dozens of countries over the past several decades, but Mexico has always been different. Mexico isn't some distant land across an ocean. It's a neighbor, a trading partner, and a country with which the United States shares not just a border, but an intricate web of economic, social, and cultural ties that make the relationship uniquely complex. The fentanyl crisis has become the driving force behind this dramatic shift in thinking. We're not talking about abstract numbers here, we're talking about over 100,000 American deaths per year attributed to drug overdoses, with fentanyl and synthetic opioids accounting for the overwhelming majority. That's more Americans dying annually from fentanyl than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. Think about that for a moment. Every single year, the equivalent of a major war's worth of American casualties, and the source material, the precursor chemicals, the manufacturing operations, they are increasingly concentrated in Mexico, often using materials imported from China and processed in clandestine labs controlled by the cartels. The Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel aren't just drug trafficking organizations anymore. They've evolved into something far more sophisticated, more militarized, and more embedded in the institutional fabric of Mexican society than most Americans realize. When Trump administration officials and national security hawks talk about designating these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, they're not just playing with semantics. That designation carries enormous legal implications under United States law. It would authorize the use of military force, allow for sanctions against anyone doing business with these organizations, and fundamentally change the legal framework under which American intelligence and military assets could operate. We've seen this playbook before in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in parts of Africa. The FTO designation becomes the legal cornerstone for intervention, for drone strikes, for special operations raids, for the entire apparatus of what's euphemistically called the war on terror. And here's where it gets fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. Mexico is saying absolutely not. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office with a mandate to continue the policies of her predecessor Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has been unequivocal in her rejection of any form of American military intervention on Mexican soil. Now, let's step back and analyze what's really at stake here, because this isn't just about drugs or crime or even sovereignty in the traditional sense. What we're witnessing is a fundamental tension between two very different paradigms of power and security. The American paradigm, at least as articulated by certain factions within the national security establishment, sees the cartels as an asymmetric threat that requires an asymmetric response. From this perspective, Mexican cartels control territory, they have military-grade weapons, they've corrupted government institutions at multiple levels, they generate billions of dollars annually, and they're directly responsible for a public health catastrophe in the United States that far exceeds the casualty rates of most conventional wars. The logic from Washington's perspective is almost inexorable. If these organizations pose an existential threat to American citizens and Mexican authorities either cannot or will not deal with them effectively, then the United States must act unilaterally to protect its interests. But Mexico's position is equally compelling when you understand the historical context. Mexico has a long and painful history of American intervention, dating back to the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, which resulted in Mexico losing nearly half its territory to the United States. That trauma runs deep in the Mexican national consciousness, and it informs every aspect of how Mexican leaders approach questions of sovereignty and foreign intervention. Beyond the historical grievances, there's a very practical concern. If the United States begins conducting military operations in Mexico, even if they are ostensibly targeted at cartels, what does that mean for Mexican sovereignty? Who decides which targets are legitimate? What happens when American drone strikes inevitably result in civilian casualties? How does the Mexican government maintain any credibility with its own population if it's seen as allowing a foreign military to operate freely within its borders? There's also the question of effectiveness, and this is where the conversation gets really interesting. The United States has spent trillions of dollars fighting the war on terror across multiple continents over more than 2 decades, and the results have been mixed at best. Afghanistan fell back to the Taliban, Iraq remains unstable despite years of American military presence, Libya descended into chaos after NATO intervention, Syria became a proxy battleground for multiple regional and global powers. The track record of military intervention solving complex political, social, and economic problems is not particularly encouraging. So when Mexican leaders look at the American proposal for military strikes against cartels, they're not just seeing a sovereignty issue, they're seeing a potential repeat of failed strategies that could destabilize their country even further while not actually solving the underlying problems that give rise to the cartels in the first place. Let's talk about those underlying problems, because this is crucial to understanding why the cartel issue is so intractable. The cartels exist and thrive because there's enormous demand for drugs in the United States and other markets, because there's massive profit to be made in meeting that demand, because there are regions in Mexico where the state has historically been weak or absent, and because corruption has become institutionalized at various levels of Mexican government and society. Military strikes might kill individual cartel leaders, might destroy specific laboratories or warehouses, but they don't address the fundamental economic incentives that drive the drug trade. We saw this play out in Colombia with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. The United States helped Colombian authorities hunt down and kill Escobar, and what happened? The Cali cartel filled the vacuum, and when they were taken down, Mexican cartel stepped up to dominate the trade. It's a Hydra situation. Cut off one head and 2 more grow back. The economic dimensions of this conflict are staggering and often underappreciated. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA, governs hundreds of billions of dollars in trade annually. Mexico is one of America's largest trading partners, and American companies have invested heavily in Mexican manufacturing, particularly in the automotive, electronics, and aerospace sectors. Millions of jobs on both sides of the border depend on the smooth functioning of this economic relationship. Now imagine introducing military conflict into that equation. What happens to supply chains when American military operations are being conducted in states like Sinaloa or Jalisco? What happens to investor confidence when there's uncertainty about whether factories might be caught in crossfire or whether transportation routes might be disrupted? The economic fallout from military intervention could dwarf the economic costs of the fentanyl crisis itself. And that's before we even consider the potential for retaliatory measures or the breakdown of bilateral cooperation on everything from immigration to energy to environmental issues. There's another layer to this that doesn't get discussed enough in mainstream media, and that's the role of American demand and American firearms in perpetuating the cartel problem. It's estimated that somewhere between 70 and 90% of the weapons used by Mexican cartels originate in the United States. American gun stores, gun shows, and private sellers are feeding an arsenal that makes Mexican cartels better armed than many national militaries. Meanwhile, American consumers are the primary market for the drugs these cartels produce. So there's a certain irony, or perhaps hypocrisy, in the United States positioning itself as the aggrieved party, demanding the right to conduct military operations in Mexico when American policies and American consumption patterns are integral parts of the problem. This doesn't absolve the cartels or the corruption within Mexico, but it does complicate the narrative of American righteousness versus Mexican failure that sometimes dominates the discourse. The intelligence picture is also far more complex than most people realize. The cartels have sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities. They use encrypted communications. They have networks of informants within Mexican security forces and government institutions, and they've demonstrated remarkable adaptability in the face of law enforcement pressure. The idea that American military forces could simply sweep into Mexico, identify and eliminate cartel leadership, and solve the problem is fantasy. These organizations are decentralized, they're resilient, and they're deeply embedded in local economies and social structures. In many parts of Mexico, particularly in rural areas, the cartels provide employment, infrastructure, and a form of governance in places where the state has failed to deliver basic services. People don't necessarily support the cartels out of ideological commitment. They support them because they're often the only game in town, the only source of economic opportunity in regions that have been neglected or abandoned by the formal economy. President Sheinbaum's rejection of military intervention also needs to be understood in the context of her administration's broader approach to security policy. She's committed to continuing the previous administration's strategy of abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets, which emphasizes addressing the root causes of violence through social programs, economic development, and strengthening civilian institutions rather than militarization. Critics argue this approach has failed, pointing to the high levels of violence that persisted throughout the López Obrador administration. Supporters counter that the militarized approaches tried by previous Mexican administrations also failed and actually made things worse in many cases by fragmenting cartels into smaller, more violent groups and further corrupting military institutions. It's a legitimate debate, and there's evidence to support multiple perspectives, but what's clear is that Sheinbaum has staked her political credibility on this approach, which makes American military intervention a non-starter from her perspective. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico. How other Latin American countries respond to potential American military operations in Mexico will be critical. Would this set a precedent for interventions elsewhere? Would it drive other countries in the region closer to China or other powers who might offer economic partnerships without the threat of military intervention? We're already seeing China expand its influence throughout Latin America through Belt and Road Initiative projects, trade agreements, and diplomatic engagement. If the United States is seen as reverting to gunboat diplomacy and interventionism, it could accelerate the erosion of American influence in a region that Washington has long considered its backyard. The optics matter enormously in a multipolar world where countries have options and where American credibility has already been damaged by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and other foreign policy setbacks. There's also the domestic political dimension within the United States that's worth examining. The fentanyl crisis has created genuine anger and fear among Americans who have lost family members or who live in communities devastated by addiction. That emotional energy can be powerful politically, and it can create pressure for action, any action that appears decisive and strong. Military strikes against cartels check those boxes superficially. They project strength, they show resolve, they send a message that America won't tolerate threats to its citizens. But whether they would actually solve the problem is an entirely different question, and there's a real risk that military intervention could become a quagmire that drains resources, costs American lives, damages international relationships, and still doesn't stop the flow of fentanyl into American communities. We've seen this pattern before, where military action is chosen not because it's the most effective solution, but because it's the most politically palatable or the most visible demonstration of power. The legal and constitutional questions are also fascinating if you dig into them. Does the president have the authority to conduct military operations in Mexico without congressional authorization? Under what legal framework would such operations occur? Would they be framed as self-defense, as counter-terrorism, as some novel application of executive power? Congress has largely abdicated its constitutional responsibility for declaring war over the past several decades, allowing presidents to conduct military operations under various authorizations and justifications, but military operations in Mexico would test those boundaries in new ways. And what about international law? Mexico is a sovereign nation, and unprovoked military strikes on its territory without its consent would violate fundamental principles of international law and the United Nations Charter. The United States could argue some form of self-defense or necessity, but those arguments would face significant legal and diplomatic challenges. What's particularly striking about this situation is how it illustrates the limits of military power in addressing complex social problems. The United States has the most powerful military in human history, with capabilities that dwarf those of any other nation, Yet this military supremacy doesn't translate into solutions for problems like drug trafficking, addiction, corruption, or economic inequality. You can't bomb your way out of a public health crisis. You can't drone strike your way to effective governance. You can't invade your way to economic development. These require different tools: diplomatic engagement, development assistance, public health interventions, criminal justice reform, demand reduction programs, and addressing the economic desperation that drives people into the drug trade in the first place. But those approaches are slower, less dramatic, harder to explain in a sound bite, and they require sustained commitment and resources without the immediate gratification of military action. The situation also highlights deeper questions about American strategy and priorities in the 21st century. The United States faces genuine challenges from peer competitors like China, from climate change, from economic inequality, from infrastructure decay, from political polarization. Yet here we are contemplating potentially getting bogged down in a military conflict with drug cartels in Mexico, which could consume enormous resources and attention while doing nothing to address those larger strategic challenges. There's an opportunity cost to every foreign policy choice, and the question is whether military intervention in Mexico represents the best use of American power and resources given the full spectrum of challenges the country faces. From a strategic perspective, it's arguably more important for the United States to maintain a stable, prosperous, cooperative relationship with Mexico than it is to pursue a militarized approach to the cartel problem that could destabilize that relationship and create unpredictable second and third order effects. As this confrontation continues to unfold, we are likely to see both sides engaging in various forms of signaling and posturing. Trump may continue to threaten military action as a form of pressure to extract concessions from Mexico on border security, immigration enforcement, or drug interdiction efforts. Sheinbaum will need to demonstrate to her domestic audience that she's defending Mexican sovereignty while also showing Washington that Mexico is taking the cartel problem seriously. There's room for negotiation here, for enhanced cooperation, for intelligence sharing, for joint task forces that respect Mexican sovereignty while leveraging American capabilities, but those solutions require nuance, patience, and a willingness to compromise, qualities that aren't always abundant in contemporary politics on either side of the border. What we're seeing play out is a high-stakes game of diplomatic chicken, where both sides have strong incentives to appear tough, but where actually following through on the most extreme threats could be catastrophic for both countries and for the broader region.